These were complex societies, and their economies were not based on just one thing. Not just based on trade with the Europeans, although that helped a lot of people come to power and become immensely influential and destructive too. A lot of new powers, not all of them were simply petty warlords that sold slaves to Europeans, or some of them were simply pawns, but some of them weren't just taking advantage, some of them took advantage of the slave trade through brilliant policy, encouraging economic growth, building military academies, and playing the politics of the area. A good book, Wonders of the African World, and he talks about some great things about Africa and dark things too. And his chapter, The Tree of Forgetfulness, I'll read part of it. It's the Tree of Forgetfulness. He says, incredibly, the kings of Dahomey forced the slaves to walk around this tree, the men 9 times, the women 7 times, so that they would forget the horrors of slavery. The kings sought to protect themselves against the wrath of slave spirits returning to curse them. They wanted their spirits to forget. The next step is the Tree of Hope, where once again the Dahomeyan kings forced the slaves to circle, signify that, despite appearances, they would still not abandon all expectations of freedom in this world or the next. At the end of the route, we finally arrived to the Gate of No Return, a huge sculpture at the edge of the beach. This symbolizes the spirits of dead slaves, who are welcomed home through this gate after they die, of the spirits of the furious slaves. Here it occurred to me the answer to the question that had haunted me throughout this journey. Had the African slavers known what horrors attend slavery in the New World compared to that slavery that was practiced at home? The Tree of Forgetfulness was my answer. They had known, and devised a ritual of continual expiation to assuage their guilt, which they resisted nonetheless. The glory of the Santi and Dahomey was constructed on a foundation of human suffering, the awareness of which demanded the perpetual repression.
During the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, from 1450 to 1850, some 11 to 12 million Africans were brought to the New World. Americans are still struggling to come to terms with the nation's history of slavery. Some West Africans also are trying to reconcile the complicity of African rulers and slave merchants. In this National Geographic radio expedition, NPR's John Burnett traveled to Benin, where he met a woman who's trying to tell the complete story of the slave trade and her own family's role in it.
From 1620 to 1900, a region of sub-Saharan West Africa that is now part of the nation of Benin was ruled by the kings of Dahomey. The story of these feared kings reposes in the memory of the tribe's oral historian, the griot. Here in the city of Abomey, once the capital of the Dahomeyan kingdom, the old man makes himself comfortable on a wooden chair. Neighbors sit nearby and squat on haunches as he begins to recount the royal epic.
Aho, dadaho, kaka de marapo.
Striking a cowbell for punctuation, the griot tells of the king's voodoo gods, their armies of fierce female warriors, their battles, their conquests, and their spoils, slaves. Martine de Souza is a griot of a different sort. She's an amateur historian and a guide at the Museum of History in Ouidah, a small tropical city on the Atlantic coast of Benin. Martine has tried to compile stories about Ouidah when it was a thriving slave port 170 years ago.
I remember the interview of one slave, Kujo Kazula. He said that he was living in a peaceful village when a lot of women just came and catched them.
Detailed shipping records tell us that 2,034,600 slaves were sent from the area of Ouidah known as the Slave Coast. The kings of Dahomey viewed chattel as their most valuable trading commodity. Their soldiers fought wars and took captives in the region that is now Nigeria, Togo, and central Benin. Some captives were put to work on the royal plantations, some were given as rewards to military officers, and others were either sold to African slave brokers or directly to European slave traders. In return, the kings received guns, fine cloth, cowrie shells, alcohol, and gold. The transatlantic slave trade finally ended around 1850, though slavery is still practiced to this day in parts of West Africa and Sudan.
The slave trade could not have endured for 4 centuries and carried nearly 12 million people out of Africa without the cooperation of a huge network of African rulers and merchants.
Robert Harms is a professor of African history at Yale University who has extensively researched the transatlantic slave trade. His recent award-winning book about a French slave ship is titled The Diligent, A Voyage Through the Worlds of the Slave Trade.
Most Americans think that ships would come from the United States or from Europe to Africa, and the sailors would just get off and run out and grab a shipload of people and stuff them in the ship and bring them back. And I think that is a very condescending view of Africans. That view suggests that Africans were so disorganized that they could let that happen year after year after year after year. I think we need to see African societies as well-organized societies that participated in the slave trade because the ruling classes often felt they had something to gain from it.
Heritage tours of the old slave ports in Ghana, Senegal, Angola, and Benin have become a popular form of cultural tourism for Africans and others in the African diaspora. Tourists come to the old Portuguese fort in Ouida, which now houses the History Museum where Martine de Souza works. In a bright yellow dress, she sits in a shady courtyard not far from the place where slaves were manacled together in dark, wretched, low-ceilinged sheds awaiting the voyage to Brazil. In her soft-spoken manner, Martine tries to educate visitors who sometimes don't like what they hear.
That's the work we do every day here. Even if we have Africans who come for visit, those Europeans that did this, let them know, wait, please, we both did it. Don't blame only the Europeans. And when they hear that we Africans, we participate, we sold our own people to the Europeans, it's always a surprise for them, and they became more angry with us. Sometimes I don't dare to tell them that I'm descendant of the Souza. Otherwise, maybe they'll hit me.
Martine's great-great-great-grandfather was the infamous slave trader Francisco Chacha de Souza. He was a shrewd and resourceful Brazilian mestizo who helped King Gezo claim the Dahomey throne. In return, the king named Chacha as Viceroy of Ouida, a lucrative position he held for 3 decades until his death in 1849. He was said to be especially skillful at smuggling slaves past the British anti-slaving flotilla. Martine freely tells museum visitors about her forefather, Chacha the slave baron, but a de Souza family elder wishes she would be more discreet about their family history.
Martine, aren't you ashamed to talk about the slave trade, to tell them that your ancestor was a slave master? Never do that again. Say, please, uncle, this is my choice. It's the history. I cannot hide the history.
To assure that the memory of slavery would never be forgotten, the 3-mile road from Ouida to the sea has been commemorated by UNESCO as the slave route. It starts at the old slave auction in front of the de Souza family compound and ends at the beach where terrified captives were ferried to the 3-masted merchant ships to make the Middle Passage. Today, the route is a well-traveled sandy lane bordered by a mangrove marsh and spindly coconut trees. Martine de Souza stands on the beach looking out at the treacherous triple surf of the Bight of Benin. It was so dangerous that slaves could not be transported in rowboats. They were carried in canoes manned by native oarsmen skilled at traversing the crashing surf. Behind her is a giant arched monument called the Door of No Return.
Can you see somebody who have never seen the sea? Look, the water is boiling and the ships are on the water with all those slaves crying with all the sharks. It's very frightening, terrible, terrible feeling.
Martine walks back up the slave route, past a group of kids kicking a soccer ball. She claims she can sense the ancestral spirits of slaves, which she also counts among her forebears, and they are angry. She says she prays for repentance for African slave traders, and she prays for reconciliation between the spirits of the D'Souza's.
It's funny, I have different feelings. If I put myself in the skin of those who were sold, it's very painful. But if I put myself in the skin of Chacha, it's shameful. But that's the history. I have no choice.